for being with us. My guest today is Dr. Patrick Corrigan. He's a licensed psychologist and professor at the Illinois Institute of Technology. And he has dedicated most of his research to suicide and also stigma in mental illness, but mainly stigma in the relationship with mental illness. Dr. Corrigan, thank you so much. I know you said call me Pat, so I will try. I'll make an effort.
Thank you, Paula, for having me.
Thank you so much for being with us. And I did spend a few days looking into your research, and it's so much to look into, and it's so interesting. And I think I mentioned this to you. It was hard for me to put this interview together because stigma is so central to suicide, and it's so important to my audience. And I know that you started your research also from a personal view because you also struggle with mental illness. So you experienced it individually. So I would like to start with that experience. If you could tell us how you became interested in stigma and mental illness.
So as you say, I'm a person with mental illness. You know, in the mental health field, there is this idea of wounded healer that a lot of people go into mental health because of their own challenges. My experience is probably in the area of serious mental illness. I've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, major depression, anxiety disorder. I've been hospitalized on locked units. I know the shame of standing at that one wall phone in the unit and calling my wife and telling her to tell my daughter Liz I wasn't going to be at school that night because I was on the inpatient program. I took meds this morning, something I still struggle with. So stigma of mental illness is not an abstract sort of thing for me.
Mm-hmm. So when you did realize, when did you realize that you had mental illness?
You know, that's not a black and white issue. I became a licensed psychologist when I was about 32, which would have been 32 years ago. And I had struggled with serious mental illness since college. And so, you know, I was a clinical psychologist. I knew a lot about the DSM and mental illness at that point, but it never really hit me until I had to go to a crisis clinic when I was about 33, and a young resident came out and said, "Oh, you're working with your depression again." And I was like, wow, you know, this is mental illness. I didn't know that before. So it's sort of an aha experience that came later.
Mm-hmm. And you wrote, I read somewhere, or maybe you said it, that you felt shame, you felt guilt for having to tell your children and what was going on and why you were in the hospital. But at the end you said, and I worried that I would fail again. And I think that word fail is so powerful because it's so common for people who do struggle with mental illness to see it as a personal failure. Did it happen to you?
Yeah, so, you know, on the stigma side, we call that self-stigma. I always think there's this terrible irony of being depressed and anxious. It's hard enough to deal with the worry and sadness, but on top of that, you're supposed to be ashamed of yourself. And I remember being on a locked unit, which was a little ironic since I had worked on locked units for 5-6 years up till then. And my children, Abe and Liz, coming in, and they were kind of taken aback and didn't know what to make of this. And I felt pretty bad because I couldn't be the rock anymore. Failure is a big part of my story. I was in medical school and dropped out. I was in a PhD program in clinical psych and dropped out. I was in a National Science Foundation program on the philosophy of science and dropped out. I would just become very anxious and depressed and overwhelmed and quit.
Mm-hmm. So and as I said before, I have heard from so many people that the fact that, first of all, they didn't know it was an illness. And it's ironic, even for a psychologist, and back then you were in touch with this kind of illness on a daily basis, and still for you, do you remember going back? I mean, what did you think it was when you felt at the time, was it depression, anxiety, everything mixed up, or was it the pressure of school?
Well, in retrospect, I think what I struggle with is an anxiety disorder, which over time evolves into depression. What did I think? I think I was overwhelmed by the setting. So it was defined by the setting. I struggled with medical school for more than a year. And that was probably one of the most stressful times in my life, and finally decided to quit. And when I left, after that, I never want to have that kind of thing again. And so when I would run up against this kind of feeling of not being able to handle work, I would quit. Was it a mental illness? I mean, if I were to be philosophical for a moment, and keep in mind, I am a licensed psychologist. I have written more than 400 peer-reviewed papers. I'm not sure what a mental illness is. I think it's a handy label, one that I sort of hang my hat on. And at some point, as I said, this was a young resident. She was 10 years younger than I was. She was her first year of psychiatry. And she just said something that just hit me over the head. Wow, that I'm sort of in that category.
And why study stigma? When did that interest come up?
Well, stigma is sort of a convergence of several things. I always like to say I'm 1960s voyeur. I was not old enough to participate in the protests, but I was old enough to watch. And so that kind of spirit and social justice always was at my base. My area of work is rehabilitation. The idea of rehabilitation is to help people with serious mental illness get back to work or get through school or live on their own or have relationships. And after doing that for about 10 years, I realized a lot of times people can't get back to work, not because of their mental illness, but because employers don't want to hire these people, or landlords don't want to rent to people, or teachers don't want those kind of students in their class. And so the problem was not the mental illness, the problem was stigma. And so we needed to fix not the person with mental illness, and we need to fix the community. And so
yeah, now that you talk about the community, can you explain to us the difference between stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination? And how does one lead to the next?
And so I would argue that stigma is a mix of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. And that's pretty much adopted from what social psychology says. So stereotypes are unflattering, disrespectful statements about a group. One group I know a lot about is Irish Americans. And so one stereotype about Irish Americans is that we're all drunks and neglect our family. Yeah. Anybody listening to this who was born in the United States would know that. The stereotypes permeate our society. Prejudice is agreeing with it. Yep, they're all drunks, having emotional feeling, and discrimination is the behavior. I don't want to be around Irish Americans. I'm not going to hire them. I'm not going to rent to them. Of course, we're much more interested in the stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination of mental illness. Perhaps the stereotype about mental illness is that we're all dangerous. But on top of that, there's also views that we're incompetent, that people with mental illness will never be capable of getting through school or having a good job, that we chose to be this way. Prejudice is agreeing with it. There's unfortunately a high rate of believing people with mental illness are dangerous, and discrimination's the behavior. So you don't want to hire them or rent to them or have them in your school.
So the relationship between stereotype, prejudice, discrimination, let me just see if I understand. So stereotype is this idea or concept of a group of people. And then after that, the prejudice is when you agree, and it also leads to some kind of emotional reaction. And then the third one, discrimination, is the behavior. So this is who they are, this is what I believe they are, and this is how I behave towards them because that's my belief.
You got it.
Okay. And you mentioned when it comes to mental illness, the dangerous. I mean, we associate crime to mental illness a lot, and unfortunately, as a journalist, I see this portrayed in the media many, many times. We see this every day. But does it depend on the kind of mental illness you have? Because, for example, depression, do we associate with what does research show? What is the kind of discrimination against people with depression as opposed to, or maybe compared to schizophrenia, for example?
So I think we want to be a bit careful because I wouldn't want people to think, well, people with depression aren't dangerous and people with schizophrenia are. Clearly, the public grossly overestimates the degree to which anybody with mental illness is dangerous. Let's be clear, in some rare cases they are. One is if a person with a mental illness diagnosis also has a substance abuse habit, they're more likely to be dangerous. But then again, so are you and me. Two is if they're anxious in the moment, revved up, out of control, they're likely to be more dangerous. But again, so are you and I if we're in a stressful situation. There is some evidence that paranoia is likely to make people a bit more dangerous, which would probably be in the psychotic range. But to understand how overestimated dangerousness is, if I had a room of 100 people and knew everything about those people, I knew about their background, their demographics, their IQ, their mental illness. The single best predictor of who is dangerous is men. The second single best predictor is age. And the third best predictor is ethnicity. In fact, if I were to guess that a Hispanic young adult were mental illness, I would be 8 times more accurate than I would be if I were to guess a person with schizophrenia is. Now, let's be clear, I'm not promoting that we lock up all Latinx young men. That would be ludicrous. But that's the degree to which the statistics show the level of dangerousness. That said, they did a study in 1996 comparing the degree to which the American population thought people with mental illness were dangerous. 1996 to 1956 were a lot more educated about mental illness. You would think it was cut in half. It was actually in the opposite direction. So the stigma of dangerousness is getting worse.
Really?
Worse.
And why is that?
Probably the best guess, and so as a scientist, we always call this post-hocking the data, so you gotta be a little careful. But probably the best guess is the degree to which we connect dangerousness, the degree to which we connect these god-awful shootings with mental illness. And so these are kind of flashbulb events. So the shooting in Connecticut and Colorado and Arizona, the one in the last couple of years in Florida where 30, 40, 50 people, often young people, are killed, leads to the media equating mental illness and dangerousness. And that's such a potent image that it really exacerbates the story. In fact, I have a friend in Australia who after the Connecticut shooting showed that the stigma in Australia about dangerousness got worse.
Wow. And you also say that when it comes to mental illness, the stigma is the label. What do you mean by that?
So stigma is the Greek word for mark. In fact, it comes from ancient Greek times. Slave owners used to identify their slaves by marking them on their cheek with a brand. And so that was an obvious mark. And so stigma were marks that lead to disrespectful stereotypes. So for example, there's a mark that indicates race, that's skin color. There's a mark that indicates gender, that's body features. There's a mark that indicates age, that's gray hair. There is no mark, obvious mark, that leads to mental illness. In fact, one way to understand the stigma of mental illness is somewhere in the same category as the stigma of LGBTQ. Now, before I go farther in that, let's be clear. I am not saying LGBTQ is a mental illness. I mean, if one thing psychiatry ever did bad, that was one thing they said. But if you're in a room with 100 people, you can't tell in the room who's gay because it's a hidden mark. And so same thing with mental illness. So the way you get stigma in mental illness is you get a label. And the way you get a label is you get seen coming out of a psychiatrist's office. And so, hey, there's Paula coming out of the psychiatrist's office. She must be nuts. Or I'm sitting next to you in the office and I see you have something called antidepressants. Wow, she must be crazy. And that's how you get the label, and people want to avoid the label. And one big way they avoid the labels, they don't seek out care. I just won't go to the psychiatrist.
So it has some very serious consequences, the fact that they have the label and they avoid that label.
Absolutely. Pretty consistently, research shows a third to a half of people with any diagnosis, be that severe diagnosis like PTSD or schizophrenia, or more benign diagnosis like grief reactions, almost half of those people won't go for care. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons is stigma. They don't want to be known as the crazy guy.
Mm-hmm. Have you done any research in terms of, you mentioned that people won't hire individuals with mental illness. Do you have research with numbers that shows, okay, that is one contributing factor or decisive factor in hiring people?
So we've done research that people with mental illness will report that as a big issue. Mm-hmm. That employers, when they find out they're mentally ill, won't hire them. I don't do what I would call big data sociological research, so I haven't looked at employment data directly, but there's two things to be concerned about stigma and employment. One is being hired, and the other is receiving reasonable accommodations. So if one of your listeners had a mental illness, it's illegal for the employer to decide not to hire him or her because of that. And two is they have to provide accommodations so that person can do his or her job, and they frequently won't get them.
Mm-hmm. Well, from your experience, what works? Because this is I think the center of my work is to fight stigma and to break the silence surrounding suicide. And that's why I do this, why I have a website, books, but am I doing this right? Because I read that education, for example, you say that education is not enough. Breaking or ending discrimination is not enough. So what works? Because I really want to learn from this and see how I can best serve my audience.
So my first study I did on changing stigma was 21 years ago. And ironically, it was about the same time the first George Bush launched the Decade of the Brain. And the National Institute of Mental Health had this whole thing about showing people brains of people with schizophrenia PET scans. And if you look at PET scan, their occipital lobe lit up, and that means they're hallucinating, and people would thought, wow, if you educate them that it's a brain disorder, they're likely to believe you're likely not to blame them for their mental illness. And that's true. Our research shows that if you teach people that mental illness like schizophrenia is a brain disorder, you won't blame them for it. But you also won't think they're going to get better. You won't think they're going to recover. It's hardwired in. I mean, I look good now, but I could flip out at any moment. And the degree to which an employer thinks it's hardwired in, it's a silent bomb, is a degree to which they're not going to hire me, or a landlord's not going to rent to me, or a teacher's not going to have me in his or her class. Mm-hmm. So education seems to be a natural, and at least in adults, the summary of the research really questions that. What's the best way to do it is contact. Now, one way to understand contact is go back to the lessons in America of the LGBTQ community. I mean, when I was a young person in the 60s, being gay was even a risky sort of thing. And so people were hiding. But courageous men and women came out with their gay, lesbian, bisexual background, so that by the time my kids got to school, they knew that they had two gay uncles and a gay minister, and heck, they had these cool flags all over school, and classmates were out. They didn't understand homophobia. As a matter of fact, it's important to realize that was not a function of learning in health class that being gay is genetic or hormonal or something. It's having a gay person they knew. And so it's the same thing with mental illness. Our research in general shows the degree to which you interact with somebody who's out with their mental illness in recovery is the most potent way to change your beliefs and to stop discriminating.
So in a way, the best, I mean, education helps. I'm not saying it doesn't help, but it's not enough. And the best way is to actually come in contact with people who have a lived experience with mental illness.
Yes. So I'm sorry, I have to lampoon education even more. First off, a lot of education programs really want to go into this biological fix. Because they really want everybody to know it's a biological disorder. And research consistently shows the more you push it's a biological disorder, the more likely stigma is going to stick.
Why is that?
Because again, it's hardwired in. You look good, but it's in your brain. It's a quiet ticking bomb. It will come back. You'll be crazy again. You'll kill everybody. So a biological model almost universally makes things worse.
Even when there is this discourse, okay, but there is treatment for it. You can get better, you can function.
And so that's the wrong message too, because that message suggests if you're a mental illness and you're not pursuing treatment, there's something wrong with you. And in personalized medicine in the United States, we now give people options to decide how they want to take care of their health problems. Blood pressure, for example. A primary care physician would say take your meds, but a more holistic person might say watch your diet, do yoga, watch what alcohol consumption. And so we respect and give people the rights to make decisions about their health. So it should be the same thing with mental health. I mean, let's be clear, medications have benefits. I took my meds this morning, but they have a lot of side effects. And sometimes their effects just aren't as good as you read in the pharmaceutical company advertisements. So people should have a right to decide how they want to handle their illness.
Let's talk about your program, Honest, Open, and Proud, because that's what it talks about. It talks about risks, how you can come out as a person with mental illness. Can you tell us a little bit about the program?
So if on one hand, I believe the more people are out, the more we'll change public stigma. Same thing with the gay population. Remember what the gay man had to deal with is coming out was very risky. Now, being in the closet is very bad for your health. Keeping secrets is very bad for your sense of self-esteem. So if you come out, it really can improve that. So Honest, Open, Proud was a program I developed. It's been active now for about 10 years with other people with lived experience. It has 3 aspects to it, 3 lessons. It's taught by peers with peer facilitators. The first lesson is consider the pros and cons of coming out, which, by the way, vary by situation. The pros and cons of coming out at work are different than at church, are different than your extended family. The second is how to come out relatively safely. So, Paul, you seem to be a nice person. If I wanted to come out to you, I might take you to Starbucks and say, hey, did you see Silver Linings Playbook? It's this movie about Bradley Cooper who has bipolar disorder. If you said, I'm sick and tired of those PC movies, you're probably not a good person for me to come out. If, on the other hand, you kind of warm up to it and I say, do you know anybody with bipolar disorder? Or do you know anybody at work like this? And what do you think? I can test you out before I ever disclose. And then the third thing is my story. What do I say? We've done 5 peer-reviewed randomized controlled trials on this. Let me share some of the findings, might be surprising. One is only about 1/3 of the people come out. That's because I reiterate what I said, there is a risk to coming out. However, there are significant benefits in self-esteem and empowerment. Because even if I stay in the closet, now I know I have that choice. And perhaps eventually people will decide to come out, but having the choice to disclose to whom, when, and how is the benefit of Honest, Open, Proud.
And in a way too, it's an incentive for other people to come out as well. Sometimes you serve as a reference. You open that door to other people.
Absolutely. We've made great strides in the United States, such this generation probably has an easier time coming out gay because people 30, 40 years ago did. Don't get me wrong, we still have a long ways to go. There's still places where it's risky admitting that sort of thing. But same thing with mental illness, is people are out. There are advocacy groups that people are out with their mental health challenges. And the more you hear that and see that, the more people with mental illness will come out for themselves. And here's a number for you. And you remember, numbers always lie, but statistically about 10% of the population is LGBTQ. Median lifetime diagnosis of mental illness statistically is about 25 to 30%. So there's 3 times more of us out there than there are people with the gay community. And so the degree to which we feel empowered to start coming out is the degree to which we're going to open that dialogue.
And when I think about suicide, for example, I see this happen all the time. I had an experience once. I was in New York with friends, and at the time I was writing the book about my dad's suicide. And we started talking, 3 people I didn't know, just through friends. And someone asked me about my book, and I talked about it. Then we changed the subject. And I don't think it has ever happened, at least in my experience, that I mentioned this in public. And after that, someone comes to me kind of in silence. Oh, Paul, I'm so glad you talked about that, and then they come out. So it is contagious in a way. And it always happens. You talk about it, nobody mentions a thing because suicide is so stigmatized and it's so silent. But then they come to me. So I'm so glad you talked about, I had an experience with this and this, either loss or attempt, both things. That's what I observe. So it's the same with mental illness, isn't it?
Suicide is an interesting thing. We actually developed our Honest Open Proud program separately for suicide, maybe only 2 or 3 years ago, because we came to look at suicide and the stigma of it as a bit different than mental illness. Perhaps one of the big things is what I say as a clinical psychology professor is suicide is the atomic bomb of mental health. Yes. I mean, in a counseling session, when suicide comes up, the whole dialogue changes. And it's probably the one thing that we universally agree needs to have an action. I'm somewhat democratic about whether you take meds and you want to change your jobs, perhaps you want to get divorced from your partner. But there's no democracy in suicide. If you say it, I need to act. And when it happens, it leaves a big wake behind it. So I think the stigma of it is probably a little bit more potent and probably a little bit more hidden than mental illness itself, at least at this point.
Because it's scary. And why is that? What have you found in research?
Well, again, sort of what I implied, it permeates our culture. Suicide is the clear marker that mental health services have failed. I mean, suicide is a mark of failure. It's a mark of failure. You blame the person, you blame the family, you blame the mental health provider. You can't take it back. I just think in Western culture, it has very significant gloom and doom around it. Let's be clear, if your listeners are a person who have had suicidal ideation or attempts, considering coming out, again, is an important part of what they might want to do. They need to realize the reaction to that can be different. I'm not always saying better or worse, but it can be different than coming out with depression. I think one of the big differences we learned in our research, and I did this with Dr. Lindsay Sheehan at my university, and the big difference is the need to act. One of the big things people who've attempted suicide, who want to tell others about their attempts, is the degree to which people feel like they need to do something. So you don't do something, so you don't act again. And that's not my intention in telling you. I just want to be a authentic person, share that with people. I don't want you to do an evaluation of whether I have a plan, an opportunity, and a time.
Hmm. Yeah,
So,
you made such a good point, because it is one of the big differences. And because the person, when you say, okay, you know, I have depression, I need to tell you that I have mental illness or I'm bipolar, and there is compassion, there is understanding, there is empathy. But the moment you say, I'm thinking about suicide, or I have suicide ideation, as you said, what can I do? What am I supposed to do? And it's so scary. So yeah,
yeah, I think it really stops conversation.
it does. It usually, what comes after the word suicide is silence.
Well, again, I think of anecdotally. I know you're a mental health provider. I know some of your listeners are. It is the one universally accepted rule is if suicide comes, you don't ignore that. You bring it up and you dig down into it, because the last thing you want is to mistake a call for help. And
Hmm.
as you know, there's all sorts of protocols to assess for the seriousness of this and the imminence of this and
Hmm.
the degree to which the person can be safe or they need to be hospitalized. It's just a very different attitudes about mental illness are opening up a bit, becoming a bit more democratic. We're less
Hmm.
likely to say, got this, do that, got this, do that. Not so with suicide.
No, it's too scary. But there's one aspect of it too, and you mentioned we are both mental health providers. But even within our colleagues and the area of mental health, it's so scary. I've heard from colleagues, unfortunately, that they're afraid of having patients with suicidal ideation. So even for people who are trained to receive and to be empathic, to be compassionate, and to know what to do, there is stigma and there is fear.
Yeah, there's absolute fear. Um, it's an interesting question whether that fearful reaction is stigma. Because again, I'm afraid to not respond right and let the patient down such that she or he goes home and dies by suicide. And as I said, it is the one universal, clear rule about how to react in mental health. Now, one of the interesting things about it is some people have a mental health practice where they're not necessarily working with people with that level of severity. And those people might not experience this kind of thing. And then one day, lo and behold, in pops somebody who's in that spectrum. That can really shock people and knock their socks off.
Hmm. And what is a good way to go around that, and to maybe, it's, if it's not stigma, if it's fear, and there is also fear of liability and all of that, I mean, what is the best approach for mental health professionals?
If somebody brings up suicide,
Not if brings, but maybe it's, how can we educate? Maybe, I know we had education, we talked about this, but
well, I think there's probably an issue of experience. I mean, again,
mm-hmm,
I supervise many graduate students, and I tell them even before they start seeing people that this is going to come up, and this will get you at your core the first 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 times. Um, but, you know, we are instruments of care. One of the things we learn is to listen to ourselves. And so if we're reacting to something with fear or stress or concern, we need to listen to that and react. Of course, the big rule, again, we learn about suicide is if a counselor hears something in the suicide space, they never ignore that. They
mm-hmm,
own it and outwardly talk to the person about it.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and be upfront about it, and not just, and because sometimes I think that we jump so fast into hospitalization, and again, as you said, what to do and what can I do for them to be safe. So I find that sometimes just sitting in with them and listening and trying to find other ways, and have you know, plan some kind of.
Yeah, I say my experience, I may have hospitalized somebody twice in my 30 years. I've seen a lot of people with suicide. Um, because somebody expressed suicide to me does not mean the next step is to put them on a locked unit. Again, the safety to me is one of the big issues. Is if you're feeling like this, do you have support system who's present, physically present and willing to help until we can take the next step. And then, of course, this whole thing about plan, opportunity, and time. But also, again, it shows what an atomic bomb this is, because danger to self and danger to others, I can take away your civil liberties. I can lock you up in a hospital. I can call the police and have them come. It's a big deal, as it should be.
Yes, yes. And also, that's the one confidentiality disclosure that we have to make, right? If you're a danger to yourself or others, I am a mandated reporter, so I'm going to have to do something about this and maybe break confidentiality.
Right.
So do you find that that's one of the things too that stop people and patients from coming out and saying openly that they're thinking about suicide? Do you find that?
Yeah, I think that's one thing that influences people talking about their mental health in general, is this is kind of first time around, kind of unsure, embarrassing, shameful, the degree to which it's private. We need to remind people that the HIPAA privacy rules are pretty strong. They're fairly well protected. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, Patrick, can you tell our listeners where they can find this program if they're interested?
So we do have a website.
Mm-hmm.
It's www.hopprogram.org.
Mm-hmm.
The programs are on there. You're welcome to download them and use them for free. We developed, original program is for adults. My students came to me about 8 years ago and said, this doesn't work for us. So they redid it for college students. It's been done for high school students, veterans, people with Tourette's. It's been translated into about 8 languages. You have to realize what it means to translate it. It's a lot more than just changing the words. It took a year to do it in Hong Kong, because it's not only an issue of translating the Cantonese, but Chinese people look at this
Cultural
stuff.
too, right?
And then what was interesting is we worked in Chengdu, which is Mandarin China. And so they also had cultural differences with the Hong Kong perspective. And I would say stigma is socially created. And so it needs to reflect the interests, concerns, perspectives of the society it's in.
Mm-hmm. And also, I'm going to have on the episode notes, you mentioned to me yesterday that you have a new research and you need applicants, participants. So if you want to talk about a little bit of this new research, and I can just add the link to the episode notes.
So again, Dr. Sheehan, who's in my group, is the person who's more carved out the stigma and suicide. And we have on the website, Honest, Open, Proud for Suicide. She's doing a study now on the degree to which people who have had suicidal ideation or attempted suicide, what they think about disclosing. And so we're trying to drill down more into whether they think disclosing is the right idea, what the benefits of it are, and the like. And what you'll put on is the link. They can go directly to the link and complete about a 20-minute interview.
Okay, now I will do that, but I want to end reading something you said that I thought was quite powerful, and it comes to having the courage to come out as a person with mental illness and being part of who you are. You said it's about solidarity. Mental illness is part of my story. This is who I am as an authentic person. Take me whole or don't take me at all. I love that. Thank you for your words, for your participation, and for your beautiful research. You've done so much for the mentally ill. Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice.